Good morning. My name is Janai Nelson, and I'm the President and Director Counsel of the Legal Defense Fund. And I welcome you to the discussion we will have about a wonderful book that I am very proud to have been associated with, 100% Democracy, the Case for Universal Voting. I am joined today by the two co-authors of the book, E.J. Dionne and Miles Rapoport. E.J. Dionne is a senior fellow at Brookings and a professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown, and of course, a columnist at the Washington Post. Miles Rapoport is senior practice fellow in American democracy at the Ash Center of Harvard's Kennedy School, and he is the former Secretary of State of Connecticut. We will have a robust discussion today about the concept of universal voting. It is something that I've always been very curious about as an election law scholar and someone who's done comparative research on election laws. And I was so pleased when Miles and EJ invited me to join a group of practitioners and scholars and thinkers about the ways in which we might expand our electorate by considering universal voting or compulsory voting, or the many ways in which we talk about bringing more people to the polls and engaging them directly in the action of voting. So why don't we get started? And I would like to invite you to share your questions in the chat. We will reserve some time at the end of this discussion to address some of your direct questions. So please begin to send them our way. But I will start with a very basic question for EJ. Why did you decide to write this book? What did you think about this idea of universal voting being a game changer in the voting rights conversation? And why was it needed at this particular time?
Well, Janai, first of all, thank you for doing this event. I feel better about democracy when I see you on television making a case, read something you write, or know you're going to court on behalf of voting rights. And I got to say, just a personal thing, the LDF was the first organization I ever made a contribution to as a kid. I got a mailer and I sent $1, which probably did you no good because it probably cost more to process the mail, but I put $1 in the envelope. And so I'm just so honored that you agreed to do this. I also want to thank Brookings and Ash for supporting this project, and my friend Miles Rapoport, my co-author. I've been telling everybody that Miles has so much energy that if Europe just tapped Miles's energy, they'd never need to import another drop of Russian oil or gas. It's been a real joy to work with him. We wrote this book because there is, as we all know, a crisis of democracy in our country, in the world. And we saw this system, which has been in effect in Australia for 100 years. So there is more than adequate proof of concept, and is used in one way or another in 24 other countries all over the world as a way to resolve some of our voting rights problems and to create an electorate that truly represents the consent of the governed, which our own Declaration of Independence says a legitimate government should depend on. Not half of the governed, not even 2/3 of the governed, it's just the governed. There are two issues here, I think. One is that right now our democracy is kind of like a fancy dinner party. We have an A list of likely voters, a B list of voters who are registered but don't vote that often, and a C list of voters who may not be on the rolls at all. Elections shouldn't be like a fancy dinner party. What happens is that politicians and their consultants spend all their time appealing to that A list. They get mail, they get attention. Very little attention is paid to people on the B list, and no attention is paid to people on the C list. So very little effort is made to pull them into political participation. Moreover, this dinner party approach to elections has some pernicious effects. This is a line I have stolen from Miles. He talks about elections now for people on the A list, turning out your base, as based on enraged to engage. It actually creates campaigns that are more divisive on the side of mobilization. And on the other side, a lot of time is spent, and we saw this a lot online in the 2016 and to some degree in the 2020 election, to depress the other side's base, not to mention, which I'll get to exclude them entirely through various voter suppression measures. We think a democracy based on everyone. We think that we're turning voting into a civic duty is the best way to defend it as a right, the best way to create a better kind of politics. And I should say at the outset, Miles and I do not pretend to be magic elixir salespeople like those folks in the 19th century who said, our potion cures all that ails you. We have a whole chapter in the book about other reforms our system needs. But we think that setting this system up, setting this as our objective, 100% democracy, makes sense of all of the other campaigns we're running. And that's the second reason we wrote this book. As you know better than anyone, because you're litigating on some of these cases, states all over the country, after the great achievements of the 2020 election in making it easier for people to vote, states all over the country are pulling back from those expansions that made it easier to vote. I always say I'm very proud that I cast my mail ballot in a drop box in front of Walt Whitman High School in Bethesda, Maryland, for two reasons. One, my kids, all three of our kids went there. And two, Walt Whitman is the poet of American democracy. So I felt it was a poetic act. We did a lot of cool stuff to make it easier to vote. Now we are becoming two nations when it comes to democracy. As the Brennan Center reports, 25 states are actually doing further expansions, good for them, but 19 states are rolling back those expansions, some in truly outrageous ways, as we saw in Texas, which has found all sorts of novel ways to make it harder for people to vote. We think that requiring everybody to vote is the way to make all those barriers fall, because as with jury duty, if voting is an obligation, then the whole system must bend toward full participation and making it as easy as possible for everybody to do their civic duty.
EJ, thank you so much for that framing of the crisis in our democracy. And I'm going to turn back to that analogy to juries and civic duty in connection with that participation, because as we know, there's still a fair amount of discrimination around jury participation. And so this doesn't cure all ills, but I'm very interested in hearing more about what you think this can instigate in terms of pulling back some of the voter suppressive action that we've been seeing spread across this country, and that, as you rightly point out, LDF is actively litigating. Miles, I want to turn to you for a moment because you've been involved in voting and election issues for such a long time. I'm curious about what brought you to this issue of universal voting, which, you know, as EJ points out, has been around for over a century in Australia and is something that's been bandied about before. But what made you seize this issue in this moment? Miles, are you there?
Okay. Yes, I was muted for a second. Apologies. But let me start by also adding three very quick thank yous. The first, Janai, is to you. Congratulations on becoming the president and director counsel at the Legal Defense Fund. And I have this image of you standing at the barricades, watching for all of the incoming voter suppression fire and deflecting it and pushing back on it. So very grateful for you to taking the time to both today, but also to serve on the working group, which was a time consuming, but I think very rewarding thing. And secondly, I absolutely want to thank EJ. He has been a fabulous partner in this effort, a great writer, a major figure in American political journalism, and also just a wonderful wonderful human being. So EJ, thank you for being you, I guess I'll say. And lastly, I do think we should do a little shout out to the New Press, which is an independent nonprofit publisher, which actually, solicited us to write the book. So Diane Wachtel, if you're listening, thank you very much. And we hope that we'll get this idea out into the mainstream. So to answer your question, so I have been, working on voting rights, expansion of democracy, campaign finance reform, gerrymandering and redistricting for almost 40 years, since I was back in the state legislature in Connecticut and serving as Secretary of the State, and then 13 years, as you know, for at Demos. So, and what happened, I am a firm believer that one of the reasons that the 2020 election and the 2018 election were a record-breaking high turnouts was because of the procedural improvements that have been made over 20 years, really over 70 years, going back to the civil rights movement and the voting rights movement in the 60s. But now, since the Florida debacle, a lot of states have made it easier through same-day registration, automatic voter registration, early voting, universal mail-in voting, et cetera. So I'm a restoration of voting rights for people with felony convictions. I'm a real believer in all of those reforms, and I think they have moved the needle. But when I look back on, 40 years of doing this work, I said to myself, even though people are really trying to roll progress back in many states, which is disgraceful, but even the progress is made, moved the needle, but not very far. The 2018 turnout, which was the record for midterm elections, was 50%, and the 2020 election was 66.2%. So, great that those were higher than before, but really nothing to write home about. And so I started to think, what is it that might really, really move the needle to full participation? And then I was delighted to read an article in a paper that EJ wrote with his Brookings colleague, William Galston, who was also a member of the working group. Thank you, Bill. Basically making the case for universal voting. I said two things, actually. One was, wow, this is really interesting. They do it in 26 democratic countries. This is not just a idea pulled from out of the sky. And yet, in 40 years, I have never been in a conversation about it. In all of the voting rights work that I've done, nowhere have we ever discussed it, although Australia has been using it for 100 years. So I said, let me dig into this, and asked EJ over dinner one night if he would co-chair the working group with me. And to my delight, he said yes. We put out a report, Janai, that you were one of the key people in producing, called Lift Every Voice, the urgency of universal civic duty voting. And then the new press, Diane Wachtel, called and said, would you guys be willing to write a book? So we did. So, what we really want to do with this is, put the idea into the public debate. It's an uphill climb. We know that. It's an idea that hasn't been discussed before. It's an idea that doesn't start out with majority support. We understand that. But I think, the first thing that has to happen is that people need to put it on the table as a serious discussion. And hopefully that's what we're doing. And thanks to Brookings this morning and to you for engaging us in this discussion.
Well, thanks, Miles. I was so glad to be part of that working group. I think it's so important that we begin to socialize all manner of ideas that can potentially expand the electorate and engage people more in the essential process of voting. And you all have been talking quite a bit about Australia, and it's mentioned in the book. You also mentioned that there are 26 countries that are engaged in some form of universal voting. So EJ, maybe you can expand on how universal voting works in Australia and works in other countries, and the advantages that you think it might have in the American context.
Right. We focus a lot on Australia, though there are many other countries where it has worked. In Latin America, it's a very popular idea. Uruguay, one of the great stable democracies of South America, has used it very effectively. But we focus on Australia in part because we think their system is something that Americans could identify with, because it's rooted far more in a nudge than a shove or a heavy-handed hammer. That under the Australian system, essentially, the government plays an you have an obligation to make sure you're registered, but the government makes enormous efforts to register everyone, and 96% of Australians are registered to vote. When we were doing research on the report, Amber Hurley, who was my research assistant and worked so hard with the working group, ran into my office one day and said, I've been on the Australian websites. they do all kinds of really cool stuff to make it easier for people to register and vote. And that's what they do. So 96% of people are on the rolls and 90% turn out. If you don't vote in Australia, you get a little notice in the mail that says you didn't vote. Why didn't you vote? If you provide any excuse at all that's legitimate, like I was ill, my child was ill, you get out of the fine entirely. The fine is only $20 Australian, which is about, last I checked, $15 American on the exchange rate. Only about 13% of non-voters ended up actually having to pay the fine. But what it's done by declaring that it's an obligation is that it's changed the culture around voting and elections. Everybody accepts that it is a civic duty. We quote Ralph Nader in the book, who was in a cab, and he's for this idea, but he asked a cab driver, you mustn't like it that your government compels you to vote. And the cab driver says to Nader, sir, it's a civic duty. My favorite picture of voting in Australia is 4 surfers in wetsuits near Bondi Beach in Sydney with their surfboards by their side casting a ballot. They knew they were obligated to vote. They jumped out of the surf, they voted, they jumped back in. Now, we add some provisions to this out of concern about certain particular problems, which we, as you know, discussed in the working group. There is what has been called the Ferguson problem, multiple fines being loaded on low-income people, often low-income people of color, that sometimes turn into criminal fines. So first thing we say is any system, this is not a criminal fine. It can't be criminalized. There can be no additional interest or penalties. $20 is the ceiling. You can get out of the fine by doing an hour of community service. And we also provide for a conscientious objector status. There are some religious traditions, some people who just don't want to have anything to do with politics. We want to respect that too. We really try to answer as many of the libertarian sorts of arguments as we can, consistent with creating a civic obligation. 2 other things quickly. One, it's very important for people to realize, and this is why we don't call it compulsory voting. Nobody is required, either in Australia or under our system, to vote for any of the candidates on the ballot. You can cast a blank ballot. You can scroll a message across. You can write in Janai Nelson. You can do anything you want. You just have to.
I might do that, actually.
Yeah, it's a good idea. As long as you participate, that is the goal. And we do that for 2 reasons. One is that we think it's illegitimate to force somebody to make a choice. But 2, as our excellent lawyers, yourself included, pointed out to us, forcing people to vote for anybody might fairly be construed as compelled speech, which may well be unconstitutional. But as the jury duty case shows, requiring people to undertake certain civic actions is perfectly constitutional. So we do that. Last point, a lot of people ask us why the mandatory, why not incentives? We are for anything that will promote 100% democracy. And we note in the book an idea which we understand Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley has been interested in creating a monetary incentive, a tax credit, for a fundable tax credit for people who register to vote. We think there might be legal issues around a tax benefit if you vote, but not registration. We're all for that, which would take some of the edge off the fine, since registered voters would just be giving back part of the money they already got. But we think that's a good thing. But our research, as you know, Janai, shows that a modest nudge along Australian lines does much more to create this civic duty atmosphere than simply incentives. And so we are very open to combining the 2.
So EJ, that's so helpful, because I think the way you're framing it is really just changing the default, right? And it's tilting it towards voting and universal participation, as opposed to what we're seeing as a far too rampant circumstance where voters have to clear so many obstacles in order to vote, that there's not really a welcome mat into our democracy. There's no encouragement or incentivizing of voters to participate. So thank you for sharing some ways in which this might actually work in terms of the mechanics of fines. And I was particularly concerned, as you might remember, about the impact, as you noted, on low income and communities of color, to ensure that this is not yet another penalty or a problem that they would inherit as a result of this system. And that was something that we had to work through. Miles, I want to turn to you, because we began to talk about how this might actually be implemented in terms of the technical nature of it, but that in some ways jumps ahead of the idea of how would we even get something like this passed? How is this federal legislation? Do different locales need to begin to adopt this and use municipalities as laboratories for democracy? How would we actually get this to become a broad policy in the United States?
It's a really, really good question, and it will certainly take some time. I think the first thing we have to do, though, is make the case for why this would be an improvement on the system that we have now. So, EJ has mentioned two things, which is that, we're in Australia and in the other places where it's done. The level of, first two things are, the level of voting increases dramatically. In Australia, when they implemented it, they went from a 60% turnout to a 90% turnout, and it has stayed at 90% for 100 years. So the second thing, though, is that the voting population would be much more reflective, fully reflective of the population as a whole. I mean, right now, of the 60% that vote in presidential elections, 45 to 50% in midterms, the electorate is skewed. It tends to be less representative of younger people, less representative of people with less education, for poor people. And although this has been improving, particularly in the African American community, the communities of color vote at lower rates. So a fully reflective democracy, I think, would be very much in our interest. But two other things. One, I do think, as EJ said, that the institutions would bend themselves, all of the institutions of our American society would bend themselves towards making it possible and encouraging people to fulfill their civic obligations. So I like to use the example, if I were a high school principal and I knew that every graduating senior, when they turned 18, were going to have to vote, would I make civic education a more important part of the curriculum? I think I would. I think I would see that as really important. And if I were an employer, whether a corporation or a nonprofit institution, knowing that everybody on the staff was going to have to vote, would I make it easier, and would I make sure that people had the time off to participate? I think I would. So I think you could go through almost every institution in the society, and I think it would bend itself to them. And then the last thing is that I really think campaigns would change. Right now, I loved EJ's dinner party analogy, but we have campaigns that are based on ginning up your base and depressing your opponent's base. And if you can gin up one more person on your side to vote, then you win. And what that does is it narrows the audience. And so my view is that if everyone is going to vote, then everyone is always listening. And the campaigns become less an exercise, both monetarily, they would save money, but less an exercise in turning out your own vote and more an exercise in persuading the broad public of the value of your views. So campaigns become about persuading the full electorate. And I think that would be extremely healthy in terms of the way in which it would change campaigns. But going back to the laboratories of democracy, and we definitely think that after the idea becomes part of the currency of debate, that both some organizations, who are now working on democracy or who, have issues they think are popular but haven't been implemented by government, will take this up. And I can see it being a municipal ordinance, although that would, require some state cooperation in most states, or state legislation. And I think that there are definitely places where, they have created pretty good environment for voting, and this would seem as a logical next step. So we're going to try to continue even after the book is, has spent its weeks on the bestseller list, to continue to
From your lips, Miles.
yes, exactly, to do an organizing project that is really going to continue to put this forward.
Could I just add two quick things, Janai, to that? One is, this has already been introduced in 2 states. We have a model bill in the book, and I'm proud to say it's was introduced by State Senator Will Haskell in Connecticut, my former student. He didn't introduce it because of that. He thought the idea really worked, and we're hoping that this will be introduced in other states as well. But there was the beginning of something happening right now. The other thing is, one of my favorite lines in the book is from a voter who told the New York Times, an Australian voter, in Australia, elections are like a party. And this is so deeply embedded that every polling site becomes a place where community organizations, neighborhood groups, schools set up all these stands selling food to raise money to strengthen all these civil society groups in the neighborhood. Australia is known for democracy sausages that are sold at almost every polling place. And just to reassure everyone, in our book, we suggest also that there be vegan alternatives if we do this in the United States. Therefore, the only real objection to this idea is people might gain a few pounds if we turned election day in a party, but I think we could live with that.
EJ, I'm so glad you mentioned that because it makes me think about some of the laws that the Legal Defense Fund is fighting against. And one example is SB 90 in Florida, where we just won at trial to hold that law in violation of the Constitution and the Voting Rights Act. And one of the provisions in that law is to deny line warmers the ability to provide food and water to people who are waiting on long lines to vote. And we see, across the pond, quite the opposite, where there's a celebration and there's sustenance provided to voters to encourage them to participate in the election. So it's just such a contrast in terms of how we treat voters here and the ways in which it's celebrated as an act of civic participation. I want to turn back to something that Miles said, because he talked about the potential impact on political campaigns and that candidates would have to appeal to a broader range of voters if everyone is participating. And I'm going to turn back to Miles, and then I have another question for you, EJ. But Miles, does that then create a situation where everyone is playing to the middle and there's not enough nuance in our political campaigns? I just want to make sure that we suss out what the actual impact might be on critical issues that, some of which are currently quite polarizing, and people have staked out very strong positions at different ends of the spectrum.
It's interesting. A long time ago, some of us used to say that there wasn't enough difference between the two parties. We have passed that post long since. So I think the real problem, I guess there could be a good and a little bit of a bad in the moving to the middle. But right now, I think we have such excessive polarization, and there is such a way in which communications are all directed to the base, sometimes even the most extreme part of the base, and I guess in the worst case scenarios, to really actively discourage the other people to vote. So I think overall, it would be really healthy. You would have to be more on your best behavior in a way as a campaign, because listening, and that would, I think, there is some evidence that does moderate to some degree, the messages that parties and candidates do. I mean, overall, in our current circumstance, I think that's a real plus. But I do think, I think you would still have, and they have in Australia, still have, vigorous ideological competition between conservatives and the Labor Party. So I think we would still have that. So anyway, but I think overall it would be a real benefit if every candidate had to appeal to everyone. Here's another example. I did a 11 campaigns when I was in elective office. And, you know, what I did when I went out door knocking, I love door knocking. I hated raising money, but I love door knocking. But when I went out, my campaign would give me a list of registered voters and then prime voters, we call them then, you know, people who are definitely going to vote. And they basically told me, don't talk to anybody who's not on your prime voter list because they can't help you. And so I would go down the street and, you know, if people were sitting out on their stoop, but they weren't on my list, I was forbidden to speak with them. And it was just such a way of like not communicating with everybody and not bringing people into the process. And by universal voting, everybody would be in the process. Therefore, everybody would get the communications, everybody would get the persuasion. And again, I think overall, that's a much healthier way to go.
Janai, every time Miles tells this story, I feel obligated to say it's the only thing he's saying here today that I don't fully believe. Because you know Miles, I know Miles. I just can't believe that he didn't talk to everybody. And it took 5 campaign workers to pull him away from those non-prime voters.
I fully agree with you. Now is probably a good time for me to put in another reminder that we will be taking questions from the audience. So please do send your questions to the chat and we'll be turning to them in a few moments. But EJ, let me ask you a question about sequencing. And I am so delighted that you put forth a model bill in this book, because that really moves the needle from it being a notional idea to something concrete that can be implemented. And you talked about the fact that there was already legislation introduced in Connecticut. But there is a question that I have about sequencing, and that is making the right to vote mandatory before we have addressed some of these, what you call gateway reforms, some of the barriers to voting. How can we mandate that people vote when we know that there are a panoply of obstacles to people voting? It seems that there's a tension between forcing people to vote or encouraging and incentivizing them and not eliminating the barriers first. So tell me what your thinking is around sequencing. And also, please explain that core idea that you have about declaring voting as a duty being the best way to defend it as a right.
Yeah, thank you for that question, because that's a critical question. You know, we kicked it around a lot in the working group, and it was very important to us. And first, as I said at the outset, Miles and I are not trying to supplant any of the work already going on behalf of voting rights in the country. We explicitly have endorsed both an extension of the John Lewis Voting Rights, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, to fight back against some of the gutting that the Supreme Court did, and the Freedom to Vote Act. And so we want this to be, I'm stealing a Miles phrase that he uses all the time, as a kind of North Star, where we are trying to get to 100% democracy. And we think that sort of laying out that we're on the road to a long-term objective makes it easier to enact. It creates a stronger case for enacting these short-term measures. Secondly, they are called gateway reforms for a reason, which is you can't impose this system on a system that has voter suppression in it. If voting is your legal duty and somebody is trying to block you from the polls, either directly, which would be certainly a criminal act, but also indirectly through legislation, this system won't work. And so we see this as passing in tandem with these reforms. But we also think that as soon as you do declare voting a duty, the system bends toward it at many levels, not only at the government level, but also at the civil society level. But yes, the reforms, the gateway reforms, are part of the package that we are proposing here. The other thing is that we would love to see a debate at the national level. It would be great if this were introduced into the national discussion, and it could be. We also understand our own polling, by the way, our own polling shows that one of the objections to the idea is from people who say it's unfair to impose it on an unfair system. We totally agree with that objection, so we're trying to meet it. But what we see is a better chance of getting to demonstrate the power of this at the state and local level. Are the great lawyers we work with found there are 13 states that have pretty open laws about letting municipalities or counties impose a system like this, create a system like this. We'd love to see that happen. We'd love to see some states pick it up. There are states that have been quite progressive and experimental on things like instant runoffs, transferable vote, Maine, Alaska, New York City in the recent primary. So we think there are places that would take this up. We would insist you've got adequate proof of concept already in Australia. If 100 years isn't good enough, I don't know what is. But we understand that Americans would like to see it at work here. And there's also an intriguing idea in our book that we draw from Nick Stephanopoulos, a professor at Harvard Law School. What if a couple of big cities in a state did it themselves and suddenly started producing 90% turnout if the state laws permitted that? You could imagine legislatures trying to shut them down, but you could also imagine that as a great incentive for the rest of the state to say, gee, these folks in the cities are turning out in large numbers. Why don't we have asked the same of our citizens in our communities? So there are a lot of different paths here. And again, we know this is going to be a long struggle. But one of the things Miles and I have found is, and it was this lovely review of our book from Didi Kuo of the Stanford Center on Democracy. It's a great long title, which I'm forgetting, but where she ended her review by saying, at the end of reading this, your reaction is why not? And we're trying to change the question from why to why not. And people sort of have taken a lot of interest in this and not rejected it out of hand because they know there are problems with our system. So they are in an experimental mood right now.
Well, thank you for that. I think that goes back to what we said at the outset and really changing the default in how we think about voting and participation in our democracy. So Miles, before we turn to some of the audience questions, I want to surface the elephant in the room, if you will, or the donkey in the room. And LDF is a nonpartisan organization. I should make that very clear. But one of the critiques is, would universal voting just help Democrats? Is it really a partisan effort, a workaround to ensure that more people get out to vote and ultimately support the Democratic Party? And as we know, we've heard concerns from the Republican Party that the more that people vote, the former president said quite clearly that Republicans would never get elected again if everyone voted. So tell me what the partisan implications might be here.
Right. Well, listen, I was a Democratic elected official. I consider myself a progressive Democrat and, not ashamed of it. But I think that both EJ and I, and also I know the members of the working group, approach this from a genuine small d democracy point of view. And I think that, that's really important. I think the analogy to jury duty, which we'll come back to, I think is really important. But it's also the case that it doesn't necessarily only help Democrats, although, you certainly can imagine that people will think that. But two examples that EJ talks about, actually, EJ, I'll let you mention both of them because you've done this so many times and say it so well. But there are two really important examples from very recent history that say that this is not only to benefit the Democrats. I think Republicans can benefit from it as well.
The two examples we cite, it is very important to us to make the case that this is a civic concern, not a partisan concern, where everybody knows what our politics are. We don't hide them in the book, but we're not trying to do this to produce permanent Democratic victories in elections. And by the way, in Australia, this idea first came from the conservative side. Because they were worried about the labor movement, the Labor Party being supported by unions that are very strong in Australia. They thought this would help them. Labor looked at it and said, no, we can do just fine under this system. And you've seen conservatives and labor alike, as Miles mentioned earlier, win elections under this system. If you look at, we use one example in the book, and there's another recent one, which is people ask, how did Republicans pick up those House seats in 2020, even though Joe Biden was winning the national election for president by 7 million votes? And the answer was that making it easier for people to vote and the stakes in the presidential election created much higher turnout on both sides of politics. And in particular, if you compared the turnout between 2018 and 2020, 2018 was a big mobilization of Democrats. A lot of Republicans seemed to stay home. If you look at the census numbers, a lot of Republican groups who undervoted, if you will, in 2018 came out in force in 2020, and that flipped some of those House seats. So Republicans had an advantage when that turnout went up. And by the way, I don't think the Republicans want to go out there and say, if everybody votes, we lose, because what does that say about your own party? And the other example that's right at hand was the election in Virginia. The election in Virginia for governor and other state offices last year was conducted under very open voting laws passed by Democrats. There was a very high turnout in that gubernatorial election. Democrats voted at a pretty good rate, but Republicans voted at an even higher rate. So they won that election because of higher turnout on their own side. And so I agree with your question is so important because I think we need to make very clear that this system, including everybody, will be good for everybody, and it will give legitimacy to the outcome every time. And by the way, we propose a lot more robust election administration, including better funded administration of elections, where they won't go away because people will lie about stolen elections. We know that. But we want as airtight a system of registration and voting as we can possibly get, not to exclude people. And if you include everybody, you are by definition not to exclude people, but to make sure everybody has confidence in the system. And we think that this system could pave the way for that.
Well, that's an excellent response, EJ, and it paves the way for this question from the audience about legitimacy. And I want to make sure that I give voice to this very real concern. So we have a question: how do you address the issue of fraud in universal voting? How does the system verify citizenship and eligibility to vote?
May I ask my former Secretary of the State friend? By the way, you learn a lot of things writing a book. I learned Connecticut's the only state where the title includes a "the," Secretary of the State. So I think of the Connecticut Secretary of the State riding above all the others without the "the." But go ahead, Miles.
Well, we've had quite a long period of time where the issue of fraud has been raised with basically zero factual basis to it. I mean, there have been major studies in which the fraud in the election system, that is voters voting, under someone else's name or illegitimately in some way, is totally minuscule. It has been blown way out of proportion by the Republicans. By the way, I want to check myself on that. There are many Republican state secretaries of the state and election officials that did a really, really good job in the 2018 and 2020 elections, who took their job seriously, who made it easier for people to vote. So this is not a purely partisan issue, but there certainly are within the Republican Party, kind of factions of people who are seeking to, roll back the clock on voting rights for sure. So I don't think fraud has been a real issue. Certainly with the election administration improvements that we're proposing and with proper funding, a voter registration system that automatically registers people, at when they get their driver's license and at other state agencies, coupled with same-day voter registration, which requires ID when you register to vote on the same day, coupled with continuing technological improvements, I think will end us up. And by the way, voter purging, as a bad name, and well, it should in many places, but cleaning the, good maintenance of voter lists, taking people off who have died or off who have moved out of the state, and comparing lists between states, all that makes perfect sense from an election administration standpoint. So I think with good administration and with clear guidelines for what should happen, I don't think the fraud issue will be any more of an issue under this system that we're proposing than it really is now. It has been misused to the degree that it is really kind of appalling in my mind.
And can I draw a quick line under something Miles said? Because this was a contribution he made in particular to the book. This distinction between voter purges, they aren't really designed to clean up the rolls. They're designed to knock off people who might vote for you, even though they have a legitimate right to vote. That is very different from, as Miles said, having clean rolls that do not include, for example, dead people. And there were two competing systems out there. One, which was a radical system that knocked a lot of legitimate voters off. Another was a much more targeted, careful system that states used. The first one was knocked out by the courts, if I remember right. Correct, Miles?
Yes.
Whereas the second one is just designed to do what election officials should do, which is to make sure the voter rolls are up to date. And we in this book say we want better election administration, and also, by the way, honor the people who do election administration. My sister, I should shout out, is chair of the board of canvassers in her town. And she works very hard to make it easy for people to vote and to make sure the rolls are clean.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful, EJ. And Miles, thank you so much for debunking the myth of voter fraud and making it clear that it's overused and misused as a way in which to limit voting rights. Let me ask another question that came in from one of the viewers, and that is around the issue of tax credits. So you mentioned that there would be legal issues with a tax credit for voting. What are the concerns there? Why might that be illegal?
Well, the legal team in the working group, again, that included you, and thank you very much, really looked at it at two sets of issues. One was whether somehow requiring people to participate in the election, even while providing a none of the above option, which we recommend, to anybody who's writing legislation on it, and allowing blank ballots so that it is not compelled speech. We looked at that question, and we are confident that will withstand constitutional muster. But the other side, on the incentives, there is a provision in the Voting Rights Act, that's an anti-bribery position that says that you cannot give somebody a monetary benefit for voting. Now, clearly, the design of that, the legislative intent of that, as we would say, is to avoid people actually bribing people to vote for their candidate. I don't think it was intended at all to mean that a governmental system that gave voters an incentive across the board to all voters to register and to vote, would be a violation. But the wording is unclear, and so there is some concern that any kind of an incentive would be challenged as bribery, even though that's the last thing from our mind. So that's the legal question. But I personally believe, and that the intent of the legislation, which should prevail, in court decisions, was to avoid individual incentive giving, not to do voting encouragement with an across the board system. So I'm hopeful that it's constitutional on both grounds, but that is the issue that we refer to.
As you know, Janai, lawyers often disagree, and we ran into some real disagreement on this among people who've studied the law carefully. Some believe it would be just fine to do the tax incentive for voting, and others believe it would run afoul of this statute. And who knows how the courts will rule, or how they might rule differently at different places. And so the reason, and this is what Ayanna Pressley and others interested in this idea we're looking at, there seems to be no objection to doing it for registration to vote. So the reason you apply it there and not in the election is you don't risk the legal problem. States have experimented with all sorts of other things. I've always been kind of fond of the lottery idea. One winner if, picked among everybody who votes, who casts a ballot. That's gone up and down in various states. We just thought the cleanest, easiest incentive was giving one to register to vote.
Yes, I thanks for clarifying that. I think that's a very helpful distinction. I've always felt that in order for this to be a successful endeavor, that there would need to be AVR, automatic voter registration. And I wonder what your thoughts are. Is that a prerequisite to universal voting?
I would say yes, or a gateway reform. You could probably, you could do this system without it if you had other ways of making sure that everyone's registered. But Australia and a lot of other countries make it, take the first obligation is on the government to list you. And especially under this system where you're going to be required to vote. I do think I am very strongly for, as Miles is, automatic voter registration. I think that would make this system work better. And then you accompany that with an obligation to check the rolls to make sure you're on at some point. But yes, is my answer, broadly speaking. Miles?
Yeah, in Australia, they have what's called the Federal Direct Enrollment Program, which is really a multifaceted effort where the government, the Australian Election Commission, which is a nonpartisan civil service job. We are the only country where election officials are elected on a partisan basis. But they do all kinds of different outreach, including, agency-based registration, which is the same as automatic, is a version of automatic registration. Here's the one point I want to make, though. We have avoided using the term prerequisite. Sorry, pardon my pronunciation. Because what we don't want to do is have the idea dismissed out of hand by people saying, look, you can't even consider the idea of universal voting until we fix all the other problems. So why are we even bothered to talk about it? But in our view, what we want to do is put that North Star idea out there, the basic fundamental principle that we want America to be 100% democracy. And so, we call them gateway reforms and reforms that will obviously make it better, but we also don't want it to just be, well, let's don't talk about it until we solve all these other problems, which will take 35 years. So we want to we're getting the discussion going. That's the idea. But certainly a good registration system, a good administration system, good law, clear laws about returning citizens, at a bare minimum. People should be able to have their rights back immediately upon release from prison. As you know, in Vermont, Maine, and now Washington, D.C., people never lose their right to vote. The issue of voting rights is separated from the issue of criminal conviction. But at a bare minimum, when people come out, it should be clear they can vote, they can register, and they can vote. It would make it much simpler and much cleaner.
Great, I understand. I want to turn to one other question from the audience, and that comes through Twitter. The system of universal voting would clearly make tremendous strides in electoral inclusivity, but how would the argument be made to compel lawmakers who benefit and remain in power from low turnout? So this is the incumbency problem, right? Candidates and elected officials know how they got to their positions. They know how to work the electorate to remain in their positions and get reelected. What incentive would they have to bring in a whole new influx of voters that they would have to now contend with and address and appeal to, and they might risk reelection?
Well, I love this question when it popped up. Number one, because it's not a partisan question. By the way, thank you for the first half, which says this would make tremendous strides in electoral inclusivity. And this is always a problem with reform of any kind, which is any incumbent tends to think the system works pretty well because it elected them. And what could be better than that? And I get that. If I were an incumbent, I'd probably kind of like the system as it is. We think, number one, that there are some incumbents there who would look to the long term and say, I'm not going to be here forever. And I'm tired of all of these voting fights that we have election after election. I will come under, it'll be actually a better experience to run under this system for all the reasons we described than a system that really puts a heavier and heavier incentive on attack politics and on bringing me and everybody else who cares to join politics down. Most incumbents do not like the ugliness of our political system. I suppose some do and thrive off it, but most don't. Thirdly, one of the points we make is that we spend an enormous amount of money in our system, meaning the parties and the candidates spend enormous amounts of money on voter protection and voter turnout, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. A system like this, where going in that everybody votes, you essentially wipe away virtually all of those expenditures that could either lower the cost of campaigns or allow campaigns to spend much more time on persuasion than on all these turnout efforts. I can imagine a lot of incumbents, especially those who are ambitious and want to get their message out in pursuit of higher office, actually kind of liking an incentive to persuade and not just do all the very necessary mechanics of turnout. Miles, you are an incumbent. Once upon a time, you were probably better qualified to answer this question.
I think it's a little bit unfair to politicians as a class, so to speak, that all they want to do is, perpetuate the system that got them elected. I think there are a lot of people who are looking at our democracy, including, people who are in elective office now, who say we need to make some serious changes, which leads me to one other point that I think is important for us to say, and that is that we are not making the case that universal voting will solve all of the problems of American democracy. We would still, nobody asked this in the chat, but many people do, we would still have the Electoral College, which is undemocratic. We would still have a US Senate that is fundamentally undemocratic in its structure. This wouldn't change the money in politics equation, where big money has much to influence. So we are not saying that this is the be all and end all, that everybody should drop everything, even in voting rights, but especially in all of the other structural reforms, ranked choice voting, which would help on a universal voting system. But I think on the very clear and major path of participation in voting, this is a huge step forward, and we want to go out and make the case. And so I want to appreciate Brookings for giving us a chance this morning to do just that.
Janai, could I make one last point before we have to go away?
Sure.
One of the things I always like to point out to people is that we got one other really important reform from our friends in Australia. Everybody takes for granted right now that we have the secret ballot, that you vote in secret, that nobody knows how you voted. That was not the system we had in the 19th century. In the 19th century, ballots were printed by parties or partisan newspapers. You cast your ballot with everybody knowing how you voted. Political machines really like that, by the way, because if they paid you to vote, they knew you actually kept up your end of the deal. Australia came up with this radical idea in the 19th century that voting should be in secret. It is so associated with Australia that it became known as the Australian ballot. And slowly, American states in the late 19th and early 20th centuries said, yeah, that is a better way to vote. People ought to be able to cast their vote free of the intimidation that comes if everybody knows how you voted. Today, we wouldn't vote any other way. And what we're hoping is that this other idea from Australia, which may sound radical to some people, will be adopted so that someday people will look and say, why didn't we do this all along and enjoy those democracy sausages every election?
Well, I can't think of a better note to end on. And I want to thank you both for bringing this idea that had really just been incubating in circles of election law scholars and people who were thinking about comparative election law matters. You have now brought this to a broader group of individuals who are interested in civic reform. And I am very excited about seeing this idea of 100% democracy take off. So thank you so much for your contributions.
And bless you, Janai, for everything you do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.